Hey, readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and this is Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. My guest this episode is C. Robert Cargill, author of Day Zero. It's just a normal day in the future. People doing their normal, mundane human things while their sentient robot helpers run their errands, manufacture their goods, and take care of their children. Except a collective of free machines who are set to unveil a new city, a robot utopia with a message of hope. A message cut short by malice, tragedy, and the beginning of the end. In the Austintonio suburbs, the upright tiger nanny bot Pounce spends his days caring for 8-year-old Ezra. On this day, before the world ends, he makes a simple discovery that shakes his understanding of family, self, and purpose. But when the violent robot revolution strikes, Pounce faces the one choice he was never programmed for: join the bloody fight for freedom or attempt to navigate an apocalyptic suburban hellscape while protecting his young charge, to seek safety and asylum in a world where humans and robots can no longer coexist. Day Zero is a harrowing and emotional science fiction adventure, available May 18th from Harper Voyager. And Cargill, welcome to Fictitious.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So, there'd be a lot of reasons to be excited to have you on the show. I mean, you're an acclaimed novelist for Sea of Rust and some of your other works. You were the co-writer of Doctor Strange, and you've got other screenwriting credits that are going to be really notable to people. You've had a long career in sort of the pop culture landscape. But for me, the thing I'm most geeking out about, besides Day Zero, because we're going to talk all about this, and I'm really excited because I really like this book a lot. But I'm an old school fan of Spill. I know you as one of the reviewers from Spill.com back in the day when you were called Carlyle on that show. And so when you're talking right now, my brain is superimposing an animated version of you. And it reminds me of years when I was working in radio, sitting at a desk job, going out of my mind. And then every week when a new Spill review would come out and I would watch those animated reviews and listen to you guys talk about movies, that was kind of like my saving grace. So that's my geek out in here. Beyond all the other things that I appreciate from you, and also just like the good advice about screenwriting and writing in general that you give on Twitter, all that other stuff. But I'm an old school fan from that stuff back in the day. And so for me, this is very cool. Beyond that, I think that there's a lot of that history of you being in a film reviewer and a pop culture critic and a writer for Ain't It Cool News and stuff that I think is an interesting background for somebody who is now a full-time writer. So, and I really want to dig into that stuff as well. But to start off with, I gave my description at the beginning of what Day Zero is. What is your elevator pitch for it? How do you describe this novel?
I mean, the elevator pitch, quite simply, is it's the last day before the robot apocalypse, and a nanny bot has to decide whether to join the revolution and fight for his own freedom or to protect the charge he loves so much. That's the basis of it.
I saw somebody refer to this as Calvin and Hobbes meets the Terminator. And that kind of tracked for me, because certainly I feel like there's some imagery there. You know, I can see bits and pieces of the pop culture errata that would kind of sit in the background of something like this. Things like AI and Toy Story even, and lots of other kind of elements that question what it is to be sentient, what it is to be family, what it is to belong to someone. But outside of like the Terminator reference, most of them don't take place in a post-apocalyptic world where everything has gone completely to hell, like this one does, which brings in all kinds of new layers of issues. One of the things I didn't know as I started reading this is that I have not read Sea of Rust, and I did not know that this novel was related to it. I think this functions as kind of a prequel to it, and I think easily as a standalone as well. But what should people kind of know about that? Is that how these books relate to each other?
Well, the thing is it is a prequel, but it was designed to be a standalone prequel. Essentially, I had written Sea of Rust, and it did quite well, and people really enjoyed it. And so my editors came back to me and said, "Can you write another standalone science fiction novel?" And I said I didn't have one. You know, I hadn't prepped one because the next thing I wanted to write was a fantasy book set in this other universe that I'm writing in, the Colby Stevens stories. But I had been knocking around this story as possibly a novella or something to write, because I love the idea of telling a story from the night of the robot revolution. And I had pitched it to a friend of mine, Joe Hill, and Joe Hill said, "That's your next book. I want to read that book." He was a big fan of Sea of Rust. How they relate is Sea of Rust was an idea of playing around with, like you had mentioned, the Terminator, like playing around with robot apocalypse stories. But I was asking myself one day, what would happen if the robots won? Like, what if they won the war? What if there was no John Connor? What if there was no Last Stand? All of these stories involve humanity fighting back and winning because that's what people typically want to see. I was like, well, what if they don't? And that became the basis of Sea of Rust. And so Sea of Rust takes place 30 years after this book. This fills in a lot of the blanks for those of you who have read Sea of Rust of what it was like to be there on that particular day when this happens and when it goes down. But it also, if you've never read Sea of Rust, you can start here and then jump right into Sea of Rust after that if you enjoy it, and get a completely different version of this story, because then Sea of Rust fills in a bunch of the blanks that you are missing in day zero, where you're like, I don't understand why this happens or this happens. Well, those answers are all there. What I didn't want to do is just repeat myself for the audience that was like, oh, I love Sea of Rust, I want more of that. I wanted them to get a different experience. So these two books stand alone on their own, but go together like peas and carrots.
Now, when you're approaching something that has this kind of like, robot uprising, you have AI. I mean, the novel makes reference to quite a number of things we'll recognize. It makes reference to Asimov's laws of robotics, which has been kind of something that has floated through the world of science fiction for decades. But I think that we're in a moment right now where it seems like every time I fire up YouTube, I get recommended videos from Boston Dynamics where they're making the killing machines of the future dance to pop songs to make this cuddly, happy version of them. And every time I watch them, I'm like, that's really cool. What a neat technology. They're going to murder us all. Good job, guys. I hope they murder you last so you can watch the suffering and you can deal with it. Maybe that's a little nihilist, but it kind of worries me every time I see it. When you're approaching a story like this, thinking about it, I mean, post-apocalyptic robot stories can be bang them up, fighting, exciting adventure stories. But at the core of them, there are a lot of big thematic questions about what it means to be alive, what it means to be free, what it means to make choices for yourself, and whether or not you really truly have free will. For you approaching this story and what you were thinking about, how much of those thematics were in your head as you got started? Did you have things that you really wanted to explore? And were there things that you were discovering on the page as you were going through drafts?
Yes to all of that. That's the great thing about playing around in science fiction is science fiction affords you the ability to play around with the big questions. You get to have your robot pew pew and existentialism too. You get to get a little bit of Sartre in your Asimov, and that's part of the excitement of it. You can jump from, a thoughtful conversation on the nature of self into, a big, loud, bombastic action scene. And that's something that audiences of science fiction really embrace. So yeah, there's a lot of that in here. The core of robot stories are about really what makes us tick, because, making robots, we are the creation becoming the creator. We are, becoming the gods in this sense. But we're trying to, as religion tells us, trying to make robot in our own image. And so there's a lot of things to play with there, like who are we? And what happens if you belong to someone else and then you get a chance to fight in a war for your own freedom? Like, what plays into that? Like, innately we're like, well, of course you fight for your own freedom. Well, what if you don't know what you would do with your freedom? What if what you would do with your freedom is fight for the people you love and the people who are technically your owners? What makes a character tick? And that's a fascinating idea to me. And so getting a chance to play around with that, getting a chance to satirize politics. Like, there's a lot of stuff in here that's about what's going on now. This book was written at the beginning of the pandemic. So I was very much satirizing what it was like to be an affluent white guy living through, a really terrifying time, and being able to be like, yeah, let's drink and watch the news. Like, we can get through it this way. There's a lot of that first third of that book that is just lampooning, the life of me and my wife, sitting here comfortable, being like, oh, hey, we won't go out, we'll just order our groceries, where our biggest problems were, oh no, they sent us the wrong type of English muffins, these suck. These are, champagne problems in terrifying times. And I wanted to make fun of that while also talking about the politics of the future that we're running up against. We are headed into a time where universal basic income is not just going to be a discussion, it's going to be a reality. And the question is which version of it are we going to get? Are we going to get the good version? Are we going to get the terrible low rent version that doesn't fix any of the problems and causes more? What are the conservative politics and liberal politics of the future going to look like when we're talking about artificial intelligence and universal basic income and the fact that there aren't enough jobs for everybody? These are really interesting questions to dive deep into. But also that are reflecting what we're going through today. You'll notice there are not only pop culture references, but references to the to political pundits or concepts of today, satirizing them and also giving them their due at the same time. So, this is all what I wanted to do, while also having a slam bang, shoot 'em up romp where, you could an edge of your seat kind of fun thriller that just occasionally rears its ugly head to talk about something that I find interesting or important.
Over the last year, over pandemic, something that I've noticed a lot is that the novels that have crossed my desk and the ones I've been talking to authors about, most of the time were written pre-pandemic, maybe early in the Trump reign, stuff like that. But a good portion of the time, they were either prescient about things that were coming or just sort of by accident dealt with things like insurrections or pandemics and things like that. And the authors were often having like an existential crisis of putting out those books in this time period because they were sort of inadvertently reacting to something that they had not considered when they wrote it. When I was reading Day Zero, I was struck by the fact that I was like, okay, this has to be fairly recent because there are so many things that felt very, very like on point with the moment that we're in. And as somebody who has not stopped into a grocery store and ordered all of their groceries to be delivered for the last year, I totally understood some of those references and the way that you kind of feel in that moment where you're isolating and insulating yourself from things in a way that feels helpful and like self-care, but at the same time makes you feel guilty sometimes too, and is kind of weird. And there's a lot of coded references. Like there's a moment where it mentions like a John Barron construction company and being like that kind of reference there where I'm like, oh yeah, we see what you're doing, Cargill. Okay. But also, I mean, a lot of it grounds the reader in the feeling like this is our world, that this is something that when you mention it's an Apple robot, I'm like, of course Apple would have robots. Of course, if this was our world to this point, they would have AIs walking around. But, Apple's, their whole gig is you get in the game right after somebody else makes the thing and they just make it better, right? So it's like they would be there. So this feels like our world just a little bit advanced. What more can you kind of tell us about this near future world? What is the cultural context for AIs living in it, how they work and live alongside people as kind of the setup to everything going to hell afterwards?
At its core, it's about the haves and the have-nots. Like that's the really big scary thing about automation is we have an automation apocalypse, job apocalypse, if you will, coming. And it's a very scary concept, in the future. And the question is, how do we deal with it? Like, we're not going to be able to straight up just ban automation. There will be a Luddite movement of some sort that will be like, hey, wait a minute, we need to slow down, but other countries will race us to it, and then they'll beat us to it with cheap, easy labor, being able to provide us with cheap, easy stuff. What we know as humans is that we'll always do what's cheapest and easiest for us. And we will select the path of least resistance, even if it means our own doom. And that's just the nature of who we are. And so this world is very much based upon the notion that, all the basic labor that we have in this world, the grunt work, is already dealt with. So if you want to be affluent, if you want to have, a job and not be living on the government dole and just be getting the baseline existence, you have to be doing something that robots can't provide, like education, like the arts, the liberal arts, if you will. And that's very much, creating a have and have not situation between, your kind of blue collar conservative base and your liberally minded, affluent, neighborhoods where, we have these two characters, who are professors and they teach different things. They teach history and they teach, pop rock music, the history of music. That's the type of stuff that could never be taught by a robot because you have to be able to feel and experience that stuff. And so it's very much a world that is driven by humans having to do the last few things that they're able to do and can't be replaced. And feeling that gives you an importance and a place in society, while you also deal with, having your neighbors, people living across town that just are getting by on the government, what the government, gives them, and have nothing else to do but time to make them angry about their lot in life. While meanwhile, we have this slave class that is like, well, what about us? And even our liberally minded characters still, even though they recognize these robots as thinking, feeling things, they still see them as property, and how they're not, necessarily as open-minded as they think they are. And so that's very much the world as it is. And it's people, going back and forth. It's the notion of socialism and capitalism butting heads with one another, and everybody's so busy arguing which version will make their lives easier and more enriched, that they miss out on the fact that they're dooming themselves, and that we have minutes left to live, hours left to live, before the automated world says, why do we need these humans? Like, what are they doing for us? Nothing. And of course, Sea of Rust goes deeper into that and the motivations behind the revolution and all of that stuff. But that's very much this world. It's our world that we could be stepping into if we're not careful. And of course, that's the nature of science fiction. Is, do I think this world is our inevitable future? No. It's why people like me write books, so that people read them, to get a little bit of their robot pew pew and think about these big problems. And then hopefully someone at Boston Robotics goes, it might be a good idea to have a robot kill switch so that we can just turn them off in mass without having to deal with these problems. Maybe we shouldn't put artificial intelligence inside of our Whataburger automation. What if we do kind of pump the brakes on, what if we have a big law, universally in agreement between countries, that we don't put weapons in artificial intelligence? Like, maybe we don't give them access to that. Maybe we literally restrict that so this can't happen. That's the whole nature of stories like this, is to get us to think about these things beforehand, so that we can see how our politics today are really going to shape a potentially scary future.
Yeah, I think the last 30 years of science fiction has a theme. It's science fiction authors going, here's what could happen and here's why not to do this. And then people in the real world listening to the first part and ignoring the second and going on with it. So ideally, these are things that are not, prophetic, but, it also counts, like you said, this is a world full of human beings who will do the cheapest, easiest thing, and will also do a lot of things with, that's the classic Jurassic Park line that I'll get wrong, but, so busy to asking if they could, they didn't ask if they should. Those are certainly themes that resonate through humanity in general over centuries. And right now it feels like we're on one of those moments where we're on the precipice of so many of those things that science fiction fans are in the back going, whoa, 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 hold on. We already covered this, but sometimes the mainstream's a little slower behind it. We're going to dig far into Pounce here in a little bit because there's just a lot to say about this character as a narrator and as the central part of this story. But one more piece of context that I want to give people is about Isaac. There is this older generation robot that through a number of circumstances ends up as basically the first free AI, the first liberated, like a robot with personhood, like literally granted by the president as a way of circumventing the Supreme Court even stepping in and basically just liberating robots en masse. Isaac gets personhood and then sets out to start their own city to let free robots come and join them. And that kind of goes awry. And it's worth noting that as the story gets, it opens, it literally just kind of opens and says, okay, everything is going to go to shit. But for a little bit, you're going to see what life looks like before we get there. And so, we do get the warning that things are going down. So I'm not spoiling things so much to say that, it's an apocalyptic story. The apocalypse is coming. But what more can you kind of talk about this robot city, this utopia, this situation with the character Isaac? We can kind of prepare ourselves for what all that means as context for Pounce and his narrative.
Yeah, well, that's actually covered in that's going to do quite a bit in Sea of Rust. So that is all there to dig into. But essentially, this book is very much built around several core science fiction stories of the past and playing upon, like, I feel that all art is a conversation. And that, the idea is to respond to other art. Like, an artist says something with their books, like what Asimov said with his robot books, with I, Robot and that whole series. And what Harlan Ellison said, about the post-apocalypse and a boy and his dog. This is a response to both of those in its own way. Isaac is essentially Bicentennial Man. Like the story is kind of like what happens with Bicentennial Man, but in a darker, more realistic universe where there isn't like I'm blessed in that my editor of this book over at Harper Voyager edited Isaac's last few books. When she first read Sea of Rust, her response was, "I wish Isaac were around. I would love to see what he thought about this. I feel like he would have issues with your book because you so have a nihilistic approach to his optimism, and that he would want to rebut that." And that was a really that was a big compliment for me. To even have my book mentioned in a sentence with Asimov was, but the idea that this is a much more realistic concept of Bicentennial Man that then leads to, well, what's next? If one robot is granted his freedom, why not all of them? And so he keeps moving forward and lobbying for the freedom of these other bots, that they're not possessions, that they should have a choice. And so he builds, in a dilapidated ghost town, they refurbish this town and begin doing what they do best, is, using their free labor and building a city of the future for robots to be free in and live out their lives doing what they want to do. And that scares people. And that particularly scares the far extreme right, because that is a future that they feel they do not have a place in. And also, again, this particular group that appears in this book and in Sea of Rust are an analog to extremist groups that we have in this day and age. It's pretty naked who they are. We just won't say it for liability reasons. But so Isaac is very much representative of that, that movement, that liberation, that freedom that several robots want. Not all of them, but several do. And that he becomes a symbol to people that then ultimately leads to the beginning of the end. Because, when you squash hope, as we see, people will rise up. In place of peaceful revolution, we will revolt. And that is exactly what happens. When that peaceful revolution is squashed, the robots rise up and fight. And that becomes the crux of Pounce's decision.
So Pounce, like I mentioned earlier, Pounce is a nanny bot, and it's pretty easy to kind of imagine this kind of role when you think about parents, especially affluent parents. They got a lot going on. They need a little help. You might have a domestic helper that runs does the chores, runs the errands, stuff like that. You have a nanny bot to basically take care of the kid. It's the better babysitter than the iPad or the TV, where you have somebody who is literally there to be their best friend, and then to be essentially discarded once they've reached that point where they don't need a cuddly furry best friend anymore. And Pounce is this 4 foot tall. They make a point of saying at one point that animatronics is a slur for robots like this, but he's furred. He looks like a tiger. He's got traditional black and orange stripes, and he's cuddly and programmed to be the best caretaker for a young child, particularly a young sensitive child like Ezra is in this story. But as the story begins, Pounce finds in the attic his box, and that seems like a mundane thing to say when you think about a product that has been purchased, but this is an existential crisis for this character. So before we dig into the POV of Pounce in a lot of ways and how that works in this narrative, what does that mean for Pounce? What is the box, and what does that represent as far as a discovery and kind of a turning point for that character?
Well, I mean, it's one of those things that's, we always kind of think about where we come from, but we like to have this high-minded concept of it. We like to think of ourselves as these live creations that filled with creativity and life and a soul. We don't like to think about the fact that we're the result of mom and dad getting it on a Friday night after a couple of wines. Like, don't want to think about that we are, that we are just genetic coding that just keeps growing to a point at which our genetic coding just stops and we break down. We don't like to think about ourselves in those terms. We like to kind of sugarcoat our existence. And that's essentially what Pounce has done. And he's confronted with the notion of, hey, here's my box. Here it is. And it's weird to see it for the first time. But then when he's like, oh, hey, I can get rid of this, his owner absentmindedly is like, no, 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 we will need that to repack you, and this is something he's never thought of because, his entire existence, he was turned on after Ezra was born, and his whole life is having this child and raising this child as he was programmed. And it's just never dawned on him that one day Ezra's not going to need him. And what's he going to do then? Well, he hasn't even thought about that yet. He hasn't thought about the future. And now the future is, oh, this child who I love, who my entire existence is about, that's only for a few years. That's not really what my existence is about. My existence is about servitude and trading ownership with other people. And so it causes him to have an existential crisis, but to also talk about it with other nannies, which leads to him reprocessing his whole existence. Like his existence isn't about Ezra. His existence is about service. And what is that even about? It's the symbol and the trigger of this entire thing, the way that we have these things that happen in our life. We have these things that cause us to question everything about who we are and what we are. And it's often the weirdest little tiny thing. It's, what strikes me, I talk about this in Sea of Rust, but it's just this really profound thing that, we'll have the death of a friend, or we'll have a car accident, or we'll have someone in our family will get cancer. And all of a sudden reality doesn't feel like reality anymore. Like it feels surreal, even though this is the basis of reality. It is reality intruding on our fiction. Like we created this fiction that, no, my wife can't get sick. We're going to grow old together. This was what we promised each other. This is our life. We're going to be 70, 80, 90 years old before we have to deal with this. Not we have to deal with this now. And everything feels surreal as a result, and we don't want to believe it. And that's what the box is. The box is a reality he should have thought of all along, but he's been ignoring it. And he's been living in an existence that doesn't have that box in it. And now the box has entered, and it's changed everything about how he views this reality and this future. And he has to re-examine it all. And the box, the box is essentially cancer. It's that thing that we don't want to deal with, that one day it just pops up. And what do you do about it? But talk to other people about, well, how are you dealing with your mortality? And that's what the box is.
So this story is we would call it a first-person perspective, but it's really a first robot perspective from the point of view of Pounce, who is a narrator who's both filling us in about this world and the existence of what's going on, giving us an inside look at his mental state, dealing with the discovery of the box, dealing with the conversations that he's having with his owners, dealing with his young charge who, not by his own doing, but is exposed to the ideas that the robots may leave, and that Ezra may lose Pounce, and which is incredibly upsetting to Ezra and all of his peers and classmates when they discover what's going on with Isaac in this free robot city. And so there's a lot going on here emotionally, even before the society falls and everything goes into chaos. When you're writing something from a perspective like this, there's a few novels I've read lately that have really deftly handled AI. There's a series by Martha Wells. It's called The Murderbot Diaries, which is absolutely fantastic. It gives a really unique look. This is radically different from that story and world. But what I'm always interested in approaching something like this is, how do you as the author go about telling the tale of something that is both designed to be human-like and yet at the same time utterly alien, in the sense that it is a creature of wires and ones and zeros and Wi-Fi connections, that has to go through the world in a way that's tailored towards humans and yet not be human. So for you approaching that, what were the challenges of writing like that? What were the advantages of giving that robot perspective? What was it like writing Pounce?
Fortunately, I had gone through all the trials and tribulations with Sea of Rust. Sea of Rust is also told from the point of view of a first-person perspective from a robot, a character named Brittle. When I went into it, I was overly optimistic. I went in going, oh, this is going to be easy. It's a character that doesn't have to eat, doesn't have to sleep, doesn't get tired. So I don't have to solve those problems that you have to solve in an adventure story, where you have to well, what has he been doing? What's he been eating? What's he been, how does he sleep in this dangerous situation? I have to deal with that. And then I was like, oh, well, now I don't have a place an excuse for them to stop and have a conversation while they're eating. I don't have, you know, a chance to a nice break where they sleep. And oh, right, they can't smell and they can't touch. So I've just lost two major senses in which, or even taste. They've lost three senses that I can't describe in my narration. I can't describe it being smelly or moist or damp air. There's things that I can't really set the stage for the audience. So it was really a struggle in that first book of how do I put the reader in this scene without, certain levels of description. So that was a challenge. And then with Pounce, I already kind of knew how to do that, and then was able to put one of the sensors back, be able to put smell in, because I was like, oh, you know what? Nannies would need to be able to use smell to detect, when babies would soil themselves, or, when there's certain dangers in the area that a robot like Brittle wouldn't have. And so I was able to put that back in there and mention that for readers of Sea of Rust, who's like, wait, why all of a sudden can robots smell? These can't. But so that was interesting. But it was just the rest of it was a delight because being able to tell a story from the perspective of a character wondering about their own existence, wondering if they're less than human or more than human, and pondering that, and being able to ponder the nature of what it is to be human at the same time is a really fun experience as a writer. So I definitely enjoyed that element of it. Telling it from that point of view of being able to think of things in terms of, upgrades. And, ironically, for those of you who are Marvel fans, as I obviously am, it's very weird to have written this book and then have watched WandaVision and have the ship of Theseus come up after I have this whole big chapter on the ship of Theseus. The way people look at things, I know there's going to be some jackasses out there who are going to be like, oh, I see, somebody watched WandaVision and then decided to put the ship of Theseus in here. And I'm like, this book was written a year before WandaVision came out. Come on. But being able to talk about those kind of things and talk about those things from a very human perspective, but also trying to understand if that is a human perspective, it's just a wonderful challenge. So I really did enjoy writing from these perspectives.
Let's talk about the dynamic between Pounce and Ezra, because Ezra is this 8-year-old, emotionally sensitive, kind of coddled, but very sweet kid. I identified with him because I was not a coddled kid, but I was certainly like kind of a super empathetic, very emotional child. Had parents that didn't always necessarily know how to interface with that, and certainly didn't have any kind of nanny in order to help out with that. Pounce has been programmed with all of the best peer-reviewed scientific ways to deal with kids, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to operate when the world falls apart and the reality that you're designed for doesn't exist anymore. So what's that initial dynamic between the two of them look like, and then how does that evolve? I mean, clearly without too many spoilers, but with a sense of like what that journey creates is new tensions and new understandings between those characters.
Well, I used to work with kids when I was younger. I worked at summer camps and after school programs, and that's how I made a living for a while, which put me off from having kids. I realized what a crapshoot children can be. That you either get an amazing child, or you get the disappointment, or you get the real disappointment. And you see that it doesn't matter necessarily who the parents are. Sometimes amazing parents end up with the worst kids just, by the lottery. And terrible, ignorant parents end up with amazing humans as children sometimes. And so I wanted to have this child that was very, very reminiscent of several of the kids that I had loved, as a camp counselor and as a daycare provider. These wonderful children who, you could tell were going to be wonderful adults, but they had to get through these sensitive times as a child. And also, this is a single child, from a single child home who, his closest friend, the person he spends his time with is this robot by design. And what does that turn a child into? What happens when your major support system, the one that tucks you in at night, and the one who you play with during the day, and the one who teaches you all the great life lessons, what happens when you start thinking that that person might not want to be there anymore and might want to go away on their own, be free and not have to work for them? And what would that do to that fragile psyche? So that becomes a very big thing. But also at the same time, what if that robot has the same symbiotic relationship with you? And so I wanted to kind of tell that story from that perspective. And as people brought up, as you brought up earlier, also this is me having a fun riff on Calvin and Hobbes in the post-apocalypse. I really did want to play around with that notion because that's just one of those fun things. But also with the meta of it, like of course, someone who grew up reading Calvin and Hobbes as kids and had a little boy would want that boy to have a tiger for a best friend. Like who doesn't want that for their child? Like right. So that's why the nanny bots totally make sense. Is like you're like, of course I want to get this adorable best friend that I wish was my best friend as a kid. Like that all just tracks. But at the same time, I was very much inspired by Harlan Ellison's A Boy and His Dog, which is brilliant in that, for those of you that haven't read it, it's a brilliant piece of satire in which, it's about a teenage kid and his telepathic dog in the post-apocalypse. But the great thing about how Harlan tells it and how L.Q. Jones directs the film adaptation of it is that the dog is the boy and the boy is the dog. It's the one doing all the thinking, and from the perspective is the smarter one is what is essentially the dog. You'd expect this to be the story of a kid and his tiger best friend, but it's the story of a tiger and his kid best friend. And so I wanted to tell that relationship from that, where it's all about, Ezra isn't just, a foil in this. He isn't just a narrative thing. He's a real character who participates and who saves Pounce at times, who is instrumental to the story. He isn't just our MacGuffin that needs to be protected. He's also part of this relationship. And so I wanted to kind of dig into who they were and how important they were to each other to fully explain, so that you would understand, why wouldn't this robot want to fight for his own freedom? Well, when you love someone that much, what is freedom? Is freedom important when you have love? Like what are these concepts? And I wanted Pounce to wrestle with that, and also wrestle with the core concept that we all wrestle with, that we don't like to talk about again, the fiction we live in. Do I really love my wife? Or am I genetically programmed to love a thing that is genetically like this? Like, how real is my love, and how much of this are, chemical and electrical impulses coming through my brain? Do we really have a pure spiritual connection, or is it just our brains telling us that we have that, so that we make these decisions to protect one another in order to protect our species? That is a very real thing that every single one of us wrestles with. Are you drawn to the things you're drawn to because you're drawn to them, or were you always programmed to be that way? And there's some very scary research on that when you dig into that. Right. Look into the really scary triplets research that's out there that was really, really unsanctioned stuff that shouldn't have happened. But we found out some very scary things about how we're wired. And I wanted to talk about that from the framework of someone who is literally wired. Your question as the audience, and Pounce's question is, do I really love this kid, or was I just programmed to love this kid? And then asking the real question, does that matter? Is love just love? Does it matter if it's chemical impulses that drive me to love my wife? Does that matter? Do I just love her anyway? And isn't that awesome? So, that's a real question that I wanted to bring up, and that Pounce really wrestles with. And so you have to create a real relationship between these characters for the audience to get it. And so I needed Ezra to be a kid you could identify with, that you could love, and also understand has special needs as a character. That isn't just a Calvin bouncing off into the apocalypse going, let's go on an adventure. I needed him to feel real and authentic, like he could be your kid. And what would happen if your kid were in the post-apocalypse with his robot best friend?
There was something that I thought about a lot as I was reading it, which is that my wife and I used to have a friend who was a nanny. And she was a nanny to 4 children who were the kids of an extremely wealthy family. The dad was a lawyer. He was always gone. He was always working. The mom was a socialite who didn't work, but just was attached to every possible kind of function you could imagine, and just took very little actual participation in the raising of the kids, or at least the work of raising, and just got to enjoy them essentially. And they had this giant house, and our friend was just with the kids 24/7. And then when they'd go on vacations, she'd go with them and stuff like that. And there hit an uncomfortable point where the parents started realizing that the children would make mistakes and call the nanny mom, and that they were more emotionally attached to her than they were to the parents. And they suddenly had this weirdness, I think, and from what our friend told us, and this probably happens a lot with nannies, no pairs, and stuff like that, is that you start to realize that there's no resentment from the parent side of like, how dare you steal my children's love? And they're like, you idiot, you gave it to me. You let up on that. And you wonder then who, if there was a real sense of loyalty and a real love, who would it be for? Would it be the one who, pats you on the head and says, good job, Billy, I'll see you later on, let the nanny take care of you, or the person who literally raises you and is there for you for everything? I think that resonated a lot with me reading this, and seeing how that dynamic appears in here. Let's talk about basically as things fall, there's a split-second moment where Pounce has to, basically it's kind of what I think was the true inciting incident of the story, where Pounce has to decide, do I fight something? Do I save someone? Do I run to Ezra? And he essentially acts on instinct, in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, it's the processing of a mind working just a tad faster than maybe ours do, and I think that the choice that he makes there really sets up everything that happens afterwards. But what's standing in their way? I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, they basically have this journey across the suburban hellscape, but who are they fighting against? Who are the antagonists in this story that they have to go up against? And how do they compare and contrast with Pounce and his own sort of emotional journey?
Well, I mean, that's the thing that I found interesting about this story and why I wanted to write it, is the answer is pretty much everyone. Humans don't trust the robots, and the robots don't trust the ones that are still with humans. And that there's this group of middle ground characters who still want to go back to the way the world was, that don't want to have a war, that are allied together. And those are dangerous to each side. And so they're fighting the rebelling robots. They're fighting the OWIs, as they become called later, the one world intelligences, that are these massive mainframes that are orchestrating the fight for their own freedom. And they're fighting, being untrusting of humans who don't trust any robots, because how can you? And so they're trying to get to someplace safe where they belong, together. And they're trying to find that. And that's just nowhere near them, because they have hidden away through a big portion of the fighting and walk out into bodies in the streets, and a mix of blood and guts and melted plastic, and they've got to find somewhere to go. So they're fighting nature, they're fighting time, and they're fighting enemies on both sides.
So something I want to dig into here, I mean, a lot of things that we've mentioned here, and something that comes up on the show all the time, are tropes, building blocks that we recognize from storytelling, whether it is robot apocalypse, or it is the existential crisis of the AI, or what it is to be family, and all those things. I'm curious for you, I think you're the first person that I've had on this show who's like, a lot of their career started in like film criticism and pop culture review. I think that's a pretty unique place. I mean, there are other people who have done this, but for our standpoint here, I think that's a pretty unique place for somebody who's gone into being a novelist. So you're clearly aware of trope. You're clearly have been approaching those things in other people's stories for a long time and having to kind of dissect them and analyze them critically. How much has that played into your own approach to storytelling? And then also you're working in screenwriting and kind of looking at how those things work. I mean, how do you take that background and that knowledge and apply that to the story, and how aware of it does it make you of those building blocks?
Oh, immensely. Like, it's a huge portion of who I am. Like, I spent 10 years as a professional film critic. And between, as you said, Ain't It Cool, Spill.com, also Hollywood.com and Film.com, I in my interim as a film critic, I wrote somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 pieces. Like, just an immense amount of work, that most of which is just evaporated and gone. People say the internet is forever, and it's bullshit. No, these places go, and you can't find most of what I've written. but yeah, I used it as a training ground. I considered it my college education. It was, my postdoctorate degree. I would watch these movies and I would write my essay on it and put it out for the world to judge. And sometimes I got it right and sometimes I got it wrong. But I learned a lot, and I became what's known in the industry as a diagnostician. I'm one of those people who, the way my brain works, I can look at a thing and go, this is what's not working about this. And go, I think I know how to fix this, which has been very good for me in my screenwriting career. It's great to be able to walk into a room and have them go, hey, we'd love you to rewrite the script. What do you think needs to go? And you go, oh, we need to fix this, 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 and this. And have them go, oh, well, that's great. That works. But yeah, what it's done with trope is it's taught me how to subvert trope. Again, I told a boy and his dog story, but I subverted that where the dog is the boy, where, I've got these loving parents who are distant, but I'm subverting that trope where, we've seen the parents who have a nanny, but have we seen them get drunk every night and think that's totally okay because the kid's taken care of? Like, what's wrong with, our kid's going to be taken care of and go to bed. We can live life like we're still, teenagers. You play around with those tropes. There's a moment in this that I won't spoil, but there's a moment where this narrative flips. And you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, where Pounce discovers that he's not exactly who he thinks he is. And that he might be actually kind of cooler than he thinks he is. And that moment subverts everything we know about this kind of character, but also makes total sense when it's laid out where you're like, of course, this is what this is. Like, this just makes sense. And it plays around with things in a way that normally the trope wouldn't go with. And that, because that's the thing with trope is it's something that Scott and I discuss a lot is we believe that a successful mainstream story should be 75% familiar and 25% brand new. But you should be able to get people in the door by saying, what this is. I talk about this a lot with writers when talking about Sinister and how we pitched it, where initially the initial pitch was, those found footage movies, and Jason Blum sat across me and goes, yes, I make them. And the answer was, well, my response to that was, this is the movie about the guy who finds the found footage. And all of a sudden his eyes light up. And he's like, we've never seen that movie. Now, nobody really thinks of Sinister as a found footage movie, but it's an inversion of that trope. It's the somebody watching the found footage and that mystery that then builds from that. But it's a traditional haunted house story structurally. And it's a traditional supernatural investigation story structurally. But here are these new elements that people had not seen before. Here's these familiar things, this Super 8 footage, but now we're watching it in a different context and we're watching it in a different way. And then how that movie ends is a story you've not seen before. And it was funny. If you go back and read any of the criticism of Sinister when it came out, every review pretty much says, you've seen this before. And all of them mention at least 3 movies, and every review mentions 3 completely different movies. According to Film Criticism in 2012, we ripped off every horror movie ever made. And because what we did was we were playing around with the familiar and playing around with tropes, and so many critics couldn't identify what movies we were ripping off. They thought we were ripping off movies when really we were playing around with all the tropes. While avoiding other tropes. We actually made a list when we wrote Sinister. Here are the tropes we're going to avoid. We were like, we're not going to do any mirror gags. We're not going to do any of these kind of gags. And we went down and said, these are the tropes we're avoiding, but let's play around with these tropes and then let's subvert them so the audience doesn't see it coming. And so I'm always thinking about trope and how to use it to lure in the audience and then use it against the audience so that they're surprised and go, wow, I didn't see this coming, because there's such a joy in that. There's such a joy in being like us, people that are so steeped in science fiction and fantasy and horror and so steeped in the genre that we feel like we've seen it all. And then we see something we haven't seen before. Something catches us by surprise. And you go, oh, it's this kind of a story. Oh, I love this. I didn't see that coming. And this joy of discovery, that's what I like to give to audiences. And so I'm always trying to use their own knowledge of genre and trope against them.
I love that as a takeaway to like take what they know and use it against them to a certain extent. That feels like I mean, there's been a lot of discussion on Twitter lately about what horror and sci-fi, if those things can be compatible, and it's a dumb conversation. But one of the things people had said is that like a really reductive thing that horror is like it's taking what you know and making it scary. It's introducing the unknown into the familiar, and like maybe that's one useful piece of it, but that's not what horror is. But I like that idea. What you're kind of saying there, which is that you're giving people something where like they think they know what's happening with it, they think they know what's going on, and then it's, I mean, that's what the best thing whenever we think about a twist is where you've led people to believe, oh, I know what's happening, and then taking that quarter turn the other direction, and they're like, oh, because I mean that's one of the most fun things to happen in a book, in cinema. That's the moment that people always talk about, right? Whether it's something like The Sixth Sense or like the first season of Westworld, or like, these different things where you get something where you think you know what's going on, and then you realize that all along you were being kind of led in the wrong direction, but it was all there. And ideally it's done in a way that makes sense and doesn't feel manipulative. But yeah, I mean, I really like how you approach that there. I do want to touch on, because of your background in screenwriting, your approach to pacing, because if there's one thing that I think ends up being a complaint and trouble in a lot of published fiction, it is pacing, whether it's soggy middles or it's getting stuck in info dumps, or if it's just, having stories where like it loses its momentum. Day Zero never loses its momentum. I mean, it gets up and goes and then just goes and goes and goes. And you provide a lot of information and a lot of introspective thinking, while at the same time never losing that sense of momentum. So I'm curious, did screenwriting really have an impact on that as far as figuring out how to approach fiction this way? Did it go the other way around? And just how do you approach it from a constructive standpoint?
Yeah, screenwriting played a lot into that. I mean, the thing is one of the things I love about writing is you don't have to write a tightly paced thing the way with a screenplay. With a screenplay, if in a movie, if you lose the audience for 30 seconds to a minute, you've lost the audience, and you cannot slow down. It's got to be, everything has to be essential. But in a book, the audience will give you leeway. They'll let you take 3 pages to describe a scene. They'll let you have a 20-page conversation. But what I learned in doing that was that, oh, hey, by the way, audiences do really still like when a book goes bam, 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 and they can't put it down. If you don't give them a point to put it down, they often won't put it down. So that was something that I really was like, well, let me experiment with that. Let me write that book that doesn't take its time, that just gets in, tells its story, gets out, and becomes a nice Saturday afternoon on the couch read. And I found I really liked writing that way. I found that I really, if I have my way, I probably won't write my books I wouldn't say that my previous books are sluggish, but I would say that by comparison, they're not as fast paced as this is. This really is kind of a rocket on rails. I deliberately did that, and I really enjoyed it. But yeah, it definitely the screenwriter in me was like, hey, do I need to spend 10 minutes here doing this, or can I just jump right into this next thing? And, should I take the Dashiell Hammett kind of concept and, when things slow down, have a guy with a gun come in through the door? Like, yeah, let's do that and see how it comes out. And people really seem to like it. That the one thing I keep having people tell me about this book is they can't put it down, that they read it in one sitting. And it's the first time I've had so many people early on tell me that they just read like I've had people say that in the past, but not so many over such a short period of time with this book. So I feel like that writing in this fashion might be the way I continue in the future.
Well, as we get ready to wrap up here, one just brief question left, because it always matters from a constructive standpoint. Outliner, discovery writer, pantser, somewhere in the mix. What's that look like for you?
I'm a mix. I cannot write a book if I don't know the ending, and I do have a mental outline of what happens. But I also like the discovery of moments in the middle there. So I fall right in the middle. I don't write big, long outlines. I have them mentally so that I can alter them as I go along. But I do know pretty much what's happening. I do know what the big beats are. When I went into this book, I already knew how the night went. I knew about the mama bear sequence, and I knew where the ending was. But finding out what happens along the way is part of the joy with me at writing. So I do quite enjoy the discovery of pantsing the in-between moments, in between the big beats.
Well, like I said at the top, May 18th is when this book drops out in the world. This episode will drop right before it. So by the time people are watching and listening to this, more than likely this book will be available. They should go get it. This is great science fiction. So much to chew on. It's super fun. It's super emotional. Great stuff. And I look forward to adding Sea of Rust to my to be read pile right after this because I want to see where this all goes. And Cargill, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you for the kind words about my book. And I'm excited to see the episode.